Chapter 1. The Inheritance. Jackson had never really known his uncle Torvek. The man was a myth in his family, a distant legend passed down through exaggerated stories and hushed whispers whenever his name came up during family gatherings. Torvek wasn't like the rest of them, he was different. An alien, of course, not one of the creatures that roamed the earth, but a member of the Galactic Empire his family had always spoken about, and that, as far as Jackson could tell, never truly existed. His uncle would occasionally make a surprise visit to Earth, though no one seemed to know where he came from, or how he traveled, always appearing out of nowhere in some strange old ship that had been given some bizarre name Jackson couldn't even remember. He was the kind of man that struck you with awe and fear at the same time, someone so far removed from everything Jackson knew that the whole concept of being his nephew seemed surreal. Growing up, Jackson had heard the stories of Torvek's travels to the furthest corners of the galaxy, how he had made a name for himself as a captain in the outer worlds, exploring ancient ruins, meeting aliens from planets that hadn't been discovered by Earth scientists, and even surviving battles against space pirates. All of it sounded incredible, but none of it ever seemed real. How could a man be capable of all that? How could someone from a far-flung part of the galaxy really have an impact on his tiny, mundane existence? His uncle's ship was supposed to be an advanced marvel of technology, capable of outmaneuvering anything in its path, sleek and powerful, the pride of the galaxy's finest fleet. The truth, however, was that Jackson never had any reason to think about it all too deeply. Until the day everything changed. It was a rainy Thursday when the letter arrived. Jackson was in his small apartment, minding his own business, when the package was dropped off by a courier who barely said a word before disappearing back into the downpour. The package was large, rectangular, and sealed with an official-looking wax emblem, a symbol Jackson instantly recognized, though it had been years since he had last seen it. It was the insignia of his uncle's Starship fleet, though the seal looked a little tarnished now. He didn't have to open it to know what it was. After all, the family had always been waiting for some kind of inheritance from the enigmatic Torvek. Jackson had heard the rumors, always dismissed them, of course, but had heard them nonetheless. And so, it wasn't a complete shock when he saw the letter and knew, deep down, that everything in his life was about to change. Ripping through the tape, Jackson uncovered a thick stack of papers, an odd assortment of documents that seemed so official, so galactic in nature, that it made his heart race with both excitement and confusion. But the real shock came when he unfolded the main letter. It wasn't just a formality. It wasn't just an envelope with a seal. This was a message, and it was addressed directly to him. His full name printed in Torvek's unmistakable handwriting. Jackson, my nephew. The letter began, the words feeling heavier as he read them aloud to himself. By the time this letter reaches you, I will no longer be among the living. My ship, the Vesperian, will be yours to command, as is your birthright. You are the next in line to carry the torch. My death was not by chance, it was the result of an old foe coming to collect the debt I owe. But even so, I leave this ship to you, for I believe you are capable of more than you think. The Vesperian may not be as it once was, but it is yours, Jackson. It will serve you well if you know how to treat it. And remember this, nephew, the galaxy is vast, and there are enemies beyond your understanding. Take care of the Vesperian, for in its engines lies the fate of more than just yourself. Jackson's hands shook as he read the letter. He hadn't expected it to be this direct, this personal. His uncle had always been a mysterious figure detached from family, distant from Earth, and yet, he had left him something far more important than a mere inheritance. The Vesperian, an ancient starship, was now his responsibility. There was a moment of complete silence as Jackson let the weight of the letter sink in. His uncle had left behind more than just a message. He had left behind a legacy that had just landed squarely in his lap. It wasn't long before the reality of it all started to settle in. The ship, the one his uncle had spoken of in almost reverent tones during their brief conversations, was no myth. It was real, and now, it was waiting for him. But Jackson wasn't a seasoned space traveler, wasn't someone who'd ever been on an intergalactic adventure. He was just an ordinary guy living in an apartment in a forgettable corner of the world. What did he know about commanding a starship? What did he know about navigating the dangers of the galaxy? About defending himself from enemies his uncle had warned him about? He didn't have the first clue about how to even pilot the ship, let alone keep it together. And from the letter, it was clear that the Vesperian had seen better days. The thought of flying a ship like that, of taking command of something so powerful and legendary, should have been exhilarating. Instead, Jackson was filled with dread. His uncle had been a decorated captain in the outer realms, leading with precision, navigating unknown sectors, and dealing with the uncharted horrors of deep space. But now the ship was his, and it was barely holding together. Torvek's words echoed in Jackson's mind. The Vesperian may not be as it once was, but it is yours. He didn't even know where to start. After reading the letter for the 100th time, Jackson decided he couldn't just sit there and let the gravity of the situation overwhelm him. If his uncle's legacy was truly his, if the Vesperian was truly his inheritance, then he had to see it for himself. He had to know what kind of ship it was, what it looked like, what it felt like to stand on the command deck of something that had once been a symbol of power and prestige in the galaxy. There was only one way to find out. Jackson quickly packed a bag and made his way to the docks, his mind racing with questions. The transport to the Starship was a long, grueling journey, the terrain shifting from the sprawling cities of Earth to the more industrialized spaceports on the outer rim. The world outside the transport window seemed to blur together, a montage of gray skies and endless stretches of barren landscape. It was a far cry from the stories his uncle had told him, the glittering, exotic worlds of the galaxy that Torvek had visited. But as the transport ship touched down, Jackson found himself standing on a familiar, sterile platform surrounded by the hum of energy and technology. The docks, he realized, were packed with space vessels, some sleek and modern, others old and clunky. But it wasn't until he stepped off the transport and followed the directions Torvek had provided that he found the ship. It was huge, but it wasn't what he had imagined. The Vesperian, the legendary starship, stood before him in all its glory, but it was barely holding together. Its once glorious hull was rusted and worn, patches of its exterior missing or corroded by time. The massive engines, once capable of reaching speeds that could outrun entire fleets, were now covered in maintenance gear and energy stabilizers. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its once pristine interior now a maze of malfunctioning systems and flickering lights. But despite all of this, there was something undeniably powerful about it. The Vesperian may have been worn, but its heart still beat, and as Jackson stepped inside, he could feel it in his bones. He couldn't help but laugh. This ship, once the envy of galactic fleets, was now his responsibility. It was nothing like the stories he had heard. There were no sleek, glittering engines or immaculate control rooms. Instead, there were wires hanging loose, panels cracked and dirty, and a series of alarms blinking sporadically. The air inside was thick with the smell of something stale, like an old relic left behind in a forgotten corner of the galaxy. But despite all of that, there was a feeling, something intangible that pulsed through the ship, like a distant echo of its former glory. The Vesperian, however battered, however damaged, still held within it the promise of adventure, the promise of power. Jackson stood at the threshold of the command deck, staring at the console before him. He had no idea how to operate it. No idea how to repair the broken systems, how to stop the ship from falling apart as he tried to figure out what his uncle had left behind. But there was one thing he did know: he couldn't leave. This ship, this legacy, was his now, for better or worse. And somehow, he was going to have to figure out how to make it work. Jackson took a deep breath, trying to steady the growing anxiety in his chest. He wasn't a spacefaring adventurer, nor was he some kind of galactic engineer who could breathe life back into this fallen titan of a ship. But staring at the control panel in front of him, with its flickering lights and cracked screens, he couldn't help but feel a surge of determination. His uncle, Torvek, had entrusted him with this ship, and despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, there was no way he was going to let it die here in this dusty dock. This was his inheritance, his challenge to rise to, and even if he didn't know exactly what he was doing, he would figure it out. Somehow, he had to. His eyes scanned the ship's systems as best as he could, trying to make sense of the overwhelming jumble of information on the screen. The Vesperian had been a beauty in its prime, sleek, streamlined, and a technological marvel of the galactic fleets. But now it looked like a relic, one that had been left to rot on some forgotten dock, the heart of it still beating but weak, hanging by a thread. The power systems were damaged, the propulsion engines barely holding together, and the ship's shielding had suffered the most, with large sections of the hull seemingly held together by nothing more than duct tape and prayer. Jackson's mind raced as he processed the disarray around him. What had happened? Why had Torvek left the ship in such a state? Was this the result of the battles he had fought, the enemies that Jackson had only heard whispers of? Or had something else been at play? Despite the wreckage, there was still an undeniable sense of power lingering in the ship's core. The ship's AI, a friendly, albeit outdated voice that had once guided Torvek through countless adventures, was still operational, albeit with a glitchy, mechanical tone that sounded a little too robotic for comfort. The console lit up briefly as the ship's computer system kicked on, projecting a holographic interface in front of Jackson. "Welcome, Captain Jackson," the AI chimed, its voice stuttering slightly. "System diagnostic initiated. Power levels at 35%. Engines compromised. Immediate maintenance required." Jackson furrowed his brow as he ran his fingers along the cracked console. "I can see that," he muttered under his breath. "What's the situation with the shielding?" The AI responded with a mechanical whir. "Shielding compromised in multiple sectors. Hull breaches detected. Priority repairs recommended in Sector 12, 16, and 23. Jackson's stomach churned at the list of failures. This was worse than he'd anticipated. The ship was barely functional, and if he couldn't get the repairs done quickly, they'd be sitting ducks in space. He wasn't equipped for this kind of thing. He had no experience fixing interstellar ships, let alone navigating one. Torvek had always been the one with the answers, the one with the knowledge of how everything worked. Jackson, by comparison, felt like a child stumbling into a grown-up world, far too out of his depth. As he stared at the flickering lights of the Vesperian's failing systems, a cold realization hit him: his uncle was gone. Torvek had left him with nothing but a broken ship and the daunting task of bringing it back to life. There would be no more stories, no more guidance. It was all on him now. He felt a pang in his chest at the thought. Torvek had been more than just an uncle to him. He had been an icon, a symbol of everything Jackson had secretly wished to be. Now that man was gone, and all that remained was the ship, this ancient vessel that was now his responsibility. Jackson took a deep breath, pushing aside the overwhelming wave of panic that threatened to take hold. He needed to focus. He needed to figure out what he could fix first. The Vesperian was still alive, and as long as it was, there was hope. His uncle hadn't left him a dead ship. He had left him something that could be brought back, something with a legacy far beyond the sum of its broken parts. If Jackson could fix it, even a little, he could restore that legacy. Without thinking, he moved to the ship's storage compartment, gathering the tools and materials scattered across the floor. He wasn't a mechanic, but he had spent years tinkering with cars and bikes back on Earth. If he could fix something as mundane as an old engine, then maybe, just maybe, he could bring the Vesperian back to life. His mind buzzed with thoughts of what to tackle first. How to get the engines running long enough to make it to the nearest station for help. How to jury-rig whatever he could to get the shields up, just enough to protect them until he figured out what to do next. There was no time to waste. The galaxy wasn't going to wait for him to get it together. And there was no way he was going to let his uncle's legacy fade into nothing. Hours passed as Jackson worked tirelessly, patching up whatever he could with the limited supplies at his disposal. The smell of burnt metal and the hum of failing systems filled the air, but he pressed on, his hands working through the ship's circuitry, trying to keep the power running just long enough to stabilize things. It was slow work, painfully slow, and every time he thought he had made progress, the ship would throw up another error or warning. But little by little, Jackson could feel the ship responding to his efforts. The engines sputtered to life. The ship's systems powered up incrementally, and though it was far from perfect, he could sense a flicker of hope. He was getting somewhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lights in the cockpit flickered to life. A small victory, but one that made his heart race with relief. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was starting to make progress. Slowly, piece by piece, he was bringing the Vesperian back from the brink of destruction. The question was no longer if he could do it, it was how long he could keep this up. As the system stabilized, Jackson settled back into the captain's chair, exhausted but determined. The journey ahead would be difficult. He wasn't sure what kind of enemies his uncle had been running from, or what the galaxy had in store for him. But one thing was clear. He had inherited more than just a ship. He had inherited a legacy, a story that was far from over, and one that he would now have to write for himself. Chapter 2. Uncharted Territory. Jackson's hands still trembled slightly as he examined the ship's systems from the command console. The ship had powered up just enough to make it operational, though the repairs were far from complete. He wasn't sure how long he could keep it running before something else broke down, but he knew he couldn't stay on this dock forever. The longer he stayed, the more likely someone or something would come looking for him. He didn't know what Torvek had gotten involved with before his death, but the warning in the letter was clear. The galaxy is vast, and there are enemies beyond your understanding. Jackson didn't know where to start. He wasn't a soldier, nor a spy, nor someone who was trained to deal with intergalactic threats. But he knew one thing. He couldn't just sit here, waiting for the inevitable. The Vesperian was his now, and with it came the responsibility of learning how to navigate not only the ship, but the dangers that came with it. As the ship's engines hummed, Jackson set the coordinates to a nearby station, a place he had heard of, a trading hub just beyond the outer rim where travelers like him could find resources and allies. He had no idea what he would find when he got there, but it was a place he could start. Maybe it would help him figure out the truth behind Torvek's enemies. Maybe it would give him a hint about the ship's true purpose, or maybe it would just give him a moment of respite before everything fell apart again. He wasn't sure what he would find at the station, but he had no other choice. The stars stretched out before him as the Vesperian slowly came to life, its once-dying systems now responding to his efforts. The ship, though still imperfect, moved through space with a sense of determination that mirrored Jackson's own. It was a long shot. It always had been. But as the Vesperian took off from the dock, the weight of the galaxy ahead of him seemed just a little bit lighter. The hum of the Vesperian's engines grew louder as Jackson engaged the ship's thrusters, guiding it carefully away from the docking station. For a brief moment, as the ship shifted into motion, Jackson felt a surge of exhilaration, like he was finally taking control of something, like he wasn't just stuck in a static, helpless world anymore. The galaxy stretched out in front of him, vast and uncertain, but it was also filled with possibility. He could make this work. He had to. His hands gripped the worn control panel, his eyes scanning the fluctuating screens as he attempted to chart a course. The navigation system was functional, but only barely. The ship's AI, though glitching sporadically, offered limited assistance, its calming voice failing to mask the underlying strain in the systems. Power levels at 22%, propulsion engines operational at 40% efficiency, shields remain offline. The more he heard, the more Jackson realized how fragile this operation was. The Vesperian might have once been a pinnacle of galactic engineering, but now, it was a patched-together relic on the edge of collapse. Even though he'd managed to stabilize the ship enough for a journey, there was no telling how long it would hold together or whether it would survive the trip. With a soft sigh, Jackson looked out the viewport at the dark, sprawling void of space that enveloped them. He couldn't help but wonder if his uncle had anticipated this. If Torvek had known that one day, his legacy would rest on the shoulders of his reluctant nephew, someone who was completely out of his depth. Jackson couldn't help but feel the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. The galaxy wasn't kind to those who were unprepared. He could be taken by any passing fleet, raided by pirates, or caught in the crossfire of a war he knew nothing about. He wasn't ready for this. But he was here. The Vesperian was his now, and whether he liked it or not, he had to make sure it made it to its destination. Every flicker of the console, every slight hesitation in the ship's movements, seemed like a reminder of the stakes. But as the ship slowly gained momentum, Jackson's mind shifted to the journey ahead. The nearest station was a couple of days out. If the ship could hold together that long, he would need supplies, but more than that, he needed to figure out where to go from there. What were Torvek's enemies, and why had they come for him? What had his uncle been involved with in the Outer Rim? And, most importantly, what did Jackson need to do to protect himself and the Vesperian? The journey to the station was long, with silence stretching between Jackson and the malfunctioning AI as it gave increasingly unreliable readings on the ship's status. Every time the ship's AI attempted to help, its voice would stutter, causing Jackson to second-guess the information, but he had little choice but to follow its direction. The quiet was interrupted only by the occasional beep from the ship's failing systems, reminding him that time was running out. He couldn't afford to waste time. There was too much at risk. As the hours passed, Jackson found himself feeling more connected to the ship, almost as if its pulse was intertwined with his own. Every jolt, every vibration, every flicker of a failing system became a part of him. The Vesperian was falling apart, yes, but there was something undeniably beautiful about it, the way it still carried itself, despite its dilapidation. It had history, it had power, and though it might not be capable of much at the moment, it had the potential to be something incredible again. Jackson wasn't sure how he knew this, but something inside him told him that if he could just get to the right place, if he could just make it to the station, he could fix this. The ship wasn't done yet, and neither was he. By the time the station finally loomed into view, Jackson had gotten used to the ship's uneven hums and creaks, the erratic flicker of lights that would burst into life for moments only to fade away into darkness again. His grip on the controls was steady now, a mixture of determination and necessity pushing him forward. The trading hub, a small, seemingly insignificant blip on the edge of known space, was his first stop, a lifeline of sorts. It was where all manner of travelers came and went: pirates, mercenaries, traders, and anyone else who didn't want to be seen or caught by the authorities. If he could get there, maybe, just maybe, he could find the resources to keep the ship alive long enough to figure out what he was supposed to do next. As they approached the station, Jackson's attention shifted to the comms panel. He hesitated before flipping the switch. He hadn't been in contact with anyone in days, and the thought of talking to another person felt strange. He hadn't realized how isolated he had become until now, with just the ship, the malfunctioning AI, and the silence for company. He wasn't used to being the one who called the shots, who had to make decisions. But this was it. This was his time to take control. The comms crackled to life, and a voice came through, harsh but neutral. "This is Drax, 11 Station. Incoming ship, state your business." Jackson's throat went dry, but he managed to find his voice. "I'm just a traveler. Need some supplies, and maybe some repairs. My ship's, well, it's not in great shape." The voice on the other end seemed to pause for a moment. Then the reply came with a hint of amusement. "Not in great shape? That's an understatement. We'll make you a deal: come in, get patched up, and pay us in whatever you have. You want to talk business, we'll talk business. Otherwise, it's all on you." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the warmest welcome, but it was enough to get him through the door. He had no money, no solid resources, but what he did have was a ship with a legacy, and maybe that would count for something. Maybe it would be enough to buy him time. He punched in the station's coordinates, eyes darting over the systems to make sure the Vesperian's distress signals weren't going off, though it was clear they would need to land soon. Time was running out. Chapter 3. The Deal. Jackson's ship docked with the station a few hours later. As the docking bay door opened with a hiss of pressurized air, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't much of a station, really. Drax 11 was one of those nondescript places that didn't have much to offer beyond its basic function, serving as a pit stop for the kinds of travelers who didn't want to be tracked. It was situated on the outer edges of the galaxy, where the stars were dimmer and the trade routes were less traveled. The hangar itself was small, cluttered with debris and the occasional piece of scrap metal that hadn't quite made it to the junkyard. A few cargo ships were parked nearby, their hulls marked with scratches and dents, their owners nowhere in sight. It looked like a place that barely held together, much like the Vesperian itself. Jackson stepped off the ship with the last remnants of the letter his uncle had left him still fresh in his mind. The Vesperian was his legacy, but now, it seemed that the ship itself had become a metaphor for everything in his life: broken, abandoned, and in need of repair. The station's air was thick with the scent of machinery, oil, and the faint smell of something else Jackson couldn't quite place. The hustle and bustle of the station's inhabitants, an odd mix of humanoids, aliens, and scavengers, was almost overwhelming at first. There was no specific direction, no order to it all. Everyone seemed to be here for their own reasons, moving in and out of different areas of the station without much interaction. The hum of technology was everywhere, but it was the kind of technology that felt outdated, a relic from a time long past. Jackson made his way toward the maintenance bay, where he hoped he would be able to find someone willing to look at the Vesperian and offer some help. His first stop was the service desk, where a woman with pale green skin and cybernetic implants greeted him with a bored glance. She didn't seem like the kind of person who cared much for details, which was fine by him. He didn't have time for explanations. "I need repairs," Jackson said, his voice low but firm. "My ship's barely holding together. I need a team to take a look at it." The woman raised an eyebrow, glancing at the half-destroyed schematic of the Vesperian on the screen in front of her. "That ship's seen better days. You're going to need more than a few quick fixes. You have the credits for something like that?" Jackson's stomach tightened. "I don't have credits," he admitted. "But I have this." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, metallic device that Torvek had left behind. The item was ancient, one of the many treasures his uncle had collected in his travels, and Jackson hoped it might be worth something. The woman's eyes flickered as she examined it. This could fetch a decent price, she muttered, her fingers dancing across the console. It'll do. You get the repairs, but you'll owe us. Jackson nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what kind of trouble he was walking into, but one thing was clear. The Vesperian wasn't going to survive much longer without some serious help. This station was his best chance. Jackson sat in the maintenance bay's dingy waiting area, his hands gripping the armrests of the old chair in front of him. The station's hum was constant, like the soft, pervasive buzz of an old engine that never quite shut off. Around him, various mechanics, smugglers, and traders came and went, exchanging quiet words and gruff looks, their faces unreadable behind the grime of space. No one seemed to care about the wreck of a ship sitting in the dock, but Jackson could feel the pressure mounting. He was running out of time. Every passing moment brought the uncertainty of what would happen next. Would they really repair the Vesperian? Or would he be left with a hefty bill, no answers, and a ship that was still a few broken bolts away from falling apart? His mind kept returning to the strange device he had handed over to the woman at the desk. It wasn't anything he recognized, just a small, glowing relic that Torvek had kept hidden in his cabin. Jackson had never dared to ask what it was, nor had he ever considered its worth. It had always been just another piece of his uncle's enigmatic life, something that didn't fit into the normal world of Earth's simple, day-to-day existence. But here, on this station, it seemed to have value. He had handed it over without hesitation, trusting the woman's assessment that it would be enough to get the Vesperian back on its feet. As he sat there, anxiety gnawing at his gut, Jackson couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about fixing a ship anymore. It was about more than that. It was about stepping into his uncle's shoes, about taking responsibility for something that had been Torvek's legacy. His uncle had been a legend, someone who had voyaged across the galaxy, forged alliances, battled enemies, and uncovered secrets that no one else could. Torvek had left behind a legacy of strength and mystery, of stories so grand that they seemed impossible. But now, it was Jackson's turn. He was the one left with the wreckage. He was the one tasked with figuring out what to do next. And the fact that his uncle had left him with no instructions only added to the pressure. The maintenance crew arrived hours later, their boots clicking on the metal floor as they approached the Vesperian's hull. Jackson stood up, his legs stiff from the long wait. The team was composed of 2 men and a woman, all wearing the station's standard jumpsuits, patched and worn from years of use. They were serious, quiet, and didn't give Jackson much more than a passing glance as they began to inspect the ship's systems. The woman who had taken his payment earlier returned to offer a few words of advice, but her expression remained the same, disinterested, transactional, as though this were just another job for her. Jackson didn't mind. He wasn't looking for pleasantries. He was looking for results. The crew moved efficiently, their hands working in sync to assess the Vesperian's various malfunctions. Every so often, one of them would stop, muttering something about a component being fried or an essential part needing replacement. Jackson couldn't understand most of what they were saying, but he didn't need to. He just needed them to make it work. He stayed out of their way, pacing around the bay as the hours passed. As the team worked, Jackson found himself thinking more and more about the galaxy. His uncle had been part of this vast, sprawling network of civilizations and dangers, of alliances and betrayals. Torvek had played a part in all of it. He had been involved in something much larger than Jackson could comprehend, something that had now fallen squarely on his shoulders. But as he stood there, watching the mechanics work on his uncle's ship, he couldn't help but wonder, what was Torvek's real legacy? What had he been running from? The ship was being pieced back together, bit by bit, but Jackson still had no answers to the questions that were gnawing at him. The crew finished their inspection by evening, the ship now repaired enough to get them to the next stop, a smaller outpost a few sectors away. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was enough to get Jackson moving again. After a quick exchange with the woman at the desk about the cost of the repairs, Jackson boarded the Vesperian, breathing in a shaky sigh of relief as the engines hummed to life. The ship wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was functional for now. Jackson knew that the road ahead was still filled with uncertainty, but for the first time since inheriting the ship, he felt like he was moving in the right direction. He had a long way to go, but at least he wasn't alone anymore. The Vesperian was with him, its broken hull, its stuttering systems, and all. And if that ship had one thing, it had heart. Now, Jackson had to find his own. Chapter 4, A Legacy of Shadows. The Vesperian's engines hummed steadily as Jackson piloted it through the silent void of space. The station and its repairs were behind them now, but ahead lay the uncharted stretches of the galaxy regions that Jackson had only heard about in his uncle's tales. The stars stretched on forever, distant and unreachable, like the mysteries of his uncle's past that Jackson would never fully understand. But as the ship moved forward, Jackson felt a strange sense of resolve. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about finding the next station or patching up the Vesperian. This ship, his uncle's legacy, was now his responsibility, and with that came a strange sense of purpose. Jackson didn't know where he was headed, but he couldn't ignore the pull in his gut. There were still pieces of Torvek's life scattered throughout the galaxy, and Jackson was determined to uncover them. The only problem was, he didn't know how. He didn't have the knowledge or the experience, and without a map, the galaxy could be a very dangerous place. But he also knew that every journey had to begin somewhere, and his had begun on this ship, the ship that had once been a symbol of power and respect. As he steered the Vesperian into the unknown, the ship's malfunctioning systems began to settle into a rhythm. The occasional stutter in the AI's voice became almost comforting, as though the ship were alive, growing stronger with every passing moment. Jackson ran his fingers along the console, the worn buttons and switches now feeling more like old friends than strange, foreign objects. His mind wandered as the ship glided through space, through the uncertainty, through the fear. He was no longer just the nephew of a mysterious space captain. He was the captain now, and for better or worse, he was responsible for everything that came next. The galaxy wasn't just a vast, empty expanse. It was full of stories, full of history, and somewhere out there, Jackson knew, was the truth about what had happened to his uncle. And that was something worth fighting for. The Vesperian wasn't just his inheritance, it was his key to something bigger. As Jackson looked out at the stars, a flicker of understanding spread through him. He wasn't just running from something anymore. He was running toward something. A destiny. A legacy. His uncle's legacy. The ship's AI flickered on again, this time with a softer, more steady voice. "Captain Jackson," it said, its voice clearer now. "We are entering an uncharted sector. Navigational guidance is unavailable." Jackson glanced up at the screen, his eyes narrowing. Ahead of them lay an expanse of empty space, a region of the galaxy untouched by civilization, devoid of stations, planets, or trade routes. It was the kind of place where anything could happen, and Jackson couldn't help but feel that this was exactly where he needed to be. The Vesperian may have been broken, but it still had purpose. And so did he. "Set a course for the nearest system," Jackson commanded. He wasn't sure where they were headed, but he knew that whatever lay ahead, it was waiting for him. This was his journey now. No more running from the past. The future was waiting, and he was ready to face it. As the Vesperian powered forward into the unknown, Jackson sat back in the captain's chair, feeling the hum of the engines beneath him, the weight of the ship's legacy resting on his shoulders. Whatever came next, whatever mysteries awaited him out in the depths of space, he was ready. He was no longer just a man on a ship. He was the captain of the Vesperian. And this was just the beginning.